So this is from Difference of Repetition, page 212, the very bottom of 212 through 213. It ends at the top of 214. It's a little long, but I think it's good. And it kind of sums up some of the themes of the method of dramatization, which would have been something he wrote and presented in front of a number of philosophers, including some of his dissertation advisors, like Ferdinand Alquier, who asked that long question at the end, because the round table is included. Any hesitation between the virtual and the possible, the order of the idea and the order of the concept, is disastrous, since it abolishes the reality of the virtual. There are traces of such an oscillation in the philosophy of Leibniz. Every time Leibniz speaks of ideas, he presents them as virtual multiplicities made of differential relations and singular points, which thought apprehends in a state close to sleep, stupor, swooning, death, amnesia, murmuring, or intoxication. However, that in which ideas are actualized is rather conceived as a possible, a realized possible. This hesitation between the possible and the virtual explains why no one has gone further than Leibniz in the exploration of sufficient reason, and why, nevertheless, no one has better maintained the illusion of a subordination of that sufficient reason to the identical. No one has come closer to a movement of vice diction in the idea, but no one has better maintained the supposed right of representation, albeit at the price of rendering it infinite. No one has been better able to immerse thought in the element of difference and provide it with a differential unconscious, surround it with little glimmerings and singularities, all in order to save and reconstitute the homogeneity of a natural light, a la Descartes. It is in effect with Descartes that the principle of representation as good sense or common sense appears in its highest form. We can call this the principle of the, quote, clear and distinct, unquote, or the principle of the proportionality of the clear and the distinct. An idea is all the more distinct the clearer it is, and clarity distinctness constitutes the light which renders thought possible in the common exercise of all the faculties. Given this principle, we cannot overemphasize the importance of a remark that Leibniz constantly makes in his Logic of Ideas. A clear idea is in itself confused. It is confused insofar as it is clear. Without doubt, this remark may be accommodated within the Cartesian logic and taken to mean simply that a clear idea is confused because it is not yet clear enough in all its parts. Moreover, is this not how Leibniz himself finally tends to interpret it? However, is it also not susceptible to another, more radical interpretation, according to which there would be a difference between the clear and the distinct, not just of degree, but in kind, such that the clear would be in itself confused and the distinct in itself obscure? What is this distinct obscure which corresponds to the clear confused? Consider Leibniz's famous passages on the murmuring of the sea. Here, two interpretations are possible. Either we say that the apperception of the whole noise is clear but confused, not distinct, because the component little perceptions are themselves not clear but obscure, or we say that the little perceptions are themselves distinct and obscure, not clear. Distinct because they grasp differential relations and singularities, obscure because they are not yet, quote, distinguished, unquote, not yet differentiated. These singularities then condense to determine a threshold of consciousness in relation to our bodies, a threshold of differentiation on the basis of which the little perceptions are actualized, but actualized in an apperception which in turn is only clear and confused. Clear because it is distinguished, or differentiated, and confused because it is clear. The problem is then no longer posed in terms of whole parts from the point of view of logical possibility, but in terms of virtual actualization of differential relations, incarnation of singular points. At this point, the value of representation in the common sense divides into two irreducible values in the parasense, a distinctness which can only be obscure, the more it is distinct, and a confusion clarity which can only be confused. The nature of the idea is to be distinct and obscure. In other words, the idea is precisely real without being actual, differentiated without being differentiated, and complete without being entire. Distinctness, obscurity is intoxication, the properly philosophical stupor, or the Dionysian idea. Leibniz very nearly encountered Dionysus at the seashore or near the watermill. Perhaps Apollo, the clear, confused thinker, is needed in order to think the idea of Dionysus. However, the two never unite in order to reconstitute a natural light. Rather, They compose two languages which are encoded in the language of philosophy and directed at the divergent exercise of the faculties, the disparity of style.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we do want to mention briefly that we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. And Taylor is spearheading a reading group. I think you're doing the last session of the Chernyavsky book on Deleuze's method. Is that right?
Yeah, I had to postpone yesterday, but we're going to be doing, and I may just do it next Saturday. Anyway, because it just depends. I want to get through this so we can start a new book. And we've got plenty of people coming to the Discord, and if you join our Patreon, obviously, I may even do this. Make like a permanent Discord link for people to join the Discord, because I know the last one we did, by default, those Discord invites expire after 7 days. So I'll put like a permanent one. I can edit it to make sure it's permanent. And so all the people joining Patreon can join our Discord. That way they can access.
They should also be getting automatic invites, was my understanding. I set
okay.
it up within
You set it up that way?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Then you've already taken care of that, and you can edit this out. But yeah, we got one more session, and then we'll have the final session at the end of January, and then we can move on. I don't mind doing any book that the group would be excited about, and if we find a good time for everybody to, but I've been proposing two of my recent translations that are forthcoming in publication. One is on Simondon's course on perception, which is really a kind of philosophy of perception to a certain extent, but based on some very concrete empirical data. And then there's Larval's wacky non-standard philosophy, which is sort of an interesting superposition of non-philosophy and quantum mechanics. So it's kind of like pick your poison. It's weird shit. But those are just shit that I've translated, and I'm definitely I want to read the stuff without having to think about the work in translation. So I also kind of want to read it for the first time, if you know what I mean. But I'm down to do all kinds of things. There's all kinds of fun stuff we could do, and I plan to keep doing these bi-weekly, or twice every 2 weeks. What bi-monthly? Yeah, that's the word. Bi-monthly reading groups, and we can just sort of see what the group wants to do, because there's obviously an endless amount of shit we could read.
Today we're going to take a look at Deleuze's The Method of Dramatization, which is from the collection Desert Islands. If you want to fill people in on what Desert Islands is broadly, because I don't think it's as referenced as often as other things. And then also I think it'd be good to discuss the context for the specific piece, The Method of Dramatization.
Absolutely. So he actually mentions, and I don't know if you saw this, he said the phrase desert island in The Method of Dramatization in his prepared speech. And it is interesting to think what he had in mind when he titled this group of, they constitute some of his essays, some of the talks he gave. So like this is kind of a prepared talk in front of a group. What is the group? Is it just does it have a name? Hold on. Let's look at the uh it says before the members of the French Society of Philosophy. So this is and I'll get into that in a second. So he gives this group in front of a distinguished, there's a number of distinguished philosophers there. Some names I don't recognize, but I assume they're part of the same society.
I was confused because Merleau-Ponty.
It's not the same Merleau-Ponty.
Okay, it's not this. All right, I was like,
No,
what the fuck is going on?
This is Jacques Merleau-Ponty.
Okay.
I don't know if they're related. I don't think they are.
I couldn't tell if I had an aneurysm or
We could do a
this was a shitty printing or something.
No, it's not Maurice. I think Maurice would have passed away by then. Like, didn't he pass away in? Oh God, I'm trying to remember when he passed away. I always forget the date of his death. I thought it was 61. So he would have been passed away by then. Let's see. Let's look. Is there anything on Jacques Merleau-Ponty? Would they be related? There's a Wikipedia page on Maurice, but not on Jacques. In any case, no. I don't think. I think we might have heard about his lesser known brother Jacques. No, so Jacques Merleau-Ponty is one of the questioners, one of the people who asked the question at the round table at the end. He did works on cosmology and epistemology and these other things. So at the very least, even if they're related, they're doing different things. But yeah, Desert Island. I'm not sure exactly what Deleuze is concretely thinking of. As I mentioned, he mentions Desert Island in passing in this in the method, but without really thematizing it. He wrote on Tournier has a novel that basically is kind of a what do you call it? A Robinsonade. It's thematic. It's themed on Robinson Crusoe type of thing. It's kind of like a retelling of it. That's, I think, Appendix 4 in The Logic of Sense. And so he might be thinking of that kind of desert island. In French, it's singular, right? It's like the desert island. So to call it desert islands already to make it plural is, I'm not saying it's wrong. It sounds more colloquial, but it's I think he is thinking of perhaps the Tournier novel, perhaps why he even mentions it in passing. But this is a group of some of his reviews. He does a review of one of Simondon's book. He writes about these are like kind of shorter writings. They're conference presentations, some essays. It's a neat assortment, and it's the other big kind of assortment of much smaller like essays and interviews is Two Regimes of Madness. So those are like the two sort of collected groups of essays. I know recently there's been the Letters and Other Texts book that's been published, and it is what it sounds like. It's more of a kind of supplementary book. So all three of those, if you will, are going to collect some of Deleuze's shorter writings throughout his life. And in this volume, Desert Islands, we have the method of dramatization. He presents this in 1967, and it's very clear that he's already worked out the bulk, I'll say, of difference and repetition, which is published in 1968, and that's his principal dissertation alongside his book on Spinoza and Expressionism. And you can already tell from the elements that he's focusing on. I would say if you look to the end of chapter 4, which is part of what the quote, the long cold open I gave, that's towards the end of chapter 4. and it goes into the beginning of chapter 5. And now the way that I think about these two chapters, if chapter 1 of different repetition is difference in itself, and then chapter 2 is repetition for itself, setting out those concepts. Chapter 3 is kind of the interlude on the image of thought, which gives us kind of the critical apparatus for really setting the stage for the rest of the book and criticizing the dogmatic image of thought that proceeds by way of common sense and good sense. Chapter 4 is going to introduce differentiation with a T, which will mainly focus on its mathematical dimensions, although, as Deleuze makes clear, it's, determining problems isn't merely a mathematical exercise, but he will go through a whole history of the calculus and work through philosophically, after revisiting some of these questions about differentials, the differential relation, the question of the infinitesimal, etc. He's going to sort of bring out the notion of the virtual, which corresponds, as he makes clear, to the T in differentiation. And then chapter 5 is going to go through the biological sciences, which will be the aspect of the actualization of the idea as opposed to its virtual side, because he's thinking of this as two halves, which is why he proposes the notion of differentiation with the C, to highlight the actualization of ideas. And this is why he goes through biology. This is why he's thinking about the egg and its dynamism, because it's the interesting thing about what eggs and embryos do as they actualize or differentiate their differential relations. We talked about the egg and the embryo a lot when we did neofinalism. And so I think that this portion of the method of dramatization, and he will talk about drama, use this term in difference repetition. He will go through this notion of staging and drama and ideas, and this will he will go through this language at the very beginning of chapter 5. So some of the most difficult stuff of the book, but it's important to note that he does say alongside this, and the translation is a little flawed. I'll talk a little bit about the flaws of the translation, but I won't harp on it too much. He says that the complete notion, because alongside differentiation with a T and a C is individuation, which would correspond to intensities. And he therefore proposes the somewhat wieldy term differentiation, right? Like, I will say in French, the normal word for differentiate, which is what we have in English, the normal way to spell it is with a T. In French, the normal way to spell that noun is with a C. So Deleuze is doing something interesting by introducing the T of differential into and combining it as one process, differentiation. And then in English, we don't really have something. I guess the C would just correspond to the C in difference, right? But so you can see that there's something interesting going on where, like, this is another reason why, like, Deleuze and Derrida are very close yet very far. They're both converging and diverging series. Derrida is doing the whole différance, right? The EA kind of silent shift, and there's a similar silent shift in the T and the C, except instead of like substituting one for the other, Deleuze is going to retain them both, but put them on different halves of the idea. One for its virtual side, which is real and structured and organized, and then the other side for its actualization in bodies, let's say, which also has its own organization. And so I will just say the one thing that the translator missed, besides messing up indifferentiation, is that they're going to translate differentiation with the T as the differential, and differentiation with the C as differentiation with the T. So it's very, I hate that, I didn't like warn you about this. I figured I would just cover it here. But whenever they talk about the differential in this book, they're talking about differentiation with the T, which kind of makes sense because, as I said, it goes back to the mathematical virtual. And then differentiation, whenever they just translate differentiation as differentiation, which technically, colloquially isn't wrong, but I think for this purposes and for looking at how Paul Patton, I think, follows Deleuze's logic very clearly, it is wrong. And the other thing that's wrong is that the translator completely suppresses Deleuze's way of writing the T and the C out. They just completely kind of ignore it and try to make it a difference between the N of differentiation and the L of differential, which I think is a choice, but it's not what Deleuze does in his French. So in any case, I would say that the translator's task there, as in any translator's task, is difficult, but they made some arbitrary choices. And the other thing being is that difference of repetition would have already been translated by Patton. And so Patton would have put down the model to follow. And it shows a lack of familiarity with what Patton was doing, staying very close to Deleuze's French and his play on the T and the C. So, dear readers, listeners, if you go and read this essay in English, just be aware of that inconsistency. The other thing that makes it clear that they didn't read difference of repetition is that they translate precursor sombre as obscure precursor. I wouldn't really care so much. I mean, dark precursor, obviously sombre can mean obscure, but French already have the obscure, and Deleuze is already working through the clear and the distinct, the obscure and the confused. So to translate you know what I'm saying? Like, sombre is a different word. And you're doing more confusion, right? You could have had some clarity, but in any case, that's all I'll say about the translation. It's just really meant as a warning. I think it's a really good essay, and essay. I call it an essay. It's a good presentation of some of the more nitty gritty aspects of difference of repetition, and the reason why he chose this. I think if you look at the questions, so much of the questions are pushing back at Deleuze's his critique of philosophy, asking the what is question, which is how it starts. He doesn't get as much. Well, that's not true. But in any case, I'm going to stop here. We can obviously explore some of that what is stuff, which we have maybe seen in some of our other conversations, but I'll let you sort of maybe give me your response to how you feel about this.
Oh, as you may guess, I think my interest in this is largely in the realm of the speculative, metaphysical, and ontological things that are going on relative to like
the Leibniz stuff, obviously.
Yeah. But I mean, even with regard to like, even let's say maybe to like pare down the question to start off would be maybe like looking at what a field is, or what Deleuze means by field versus like something like milieu with respect to differentiate. I don't know. I'm not even going to wade into that part of it. But
Yeah.
let me give you just a little bit of context for that. Would go back to the kind of rooted stuff about the embryo, right? Because like is the embryo is kind of like a microcosm for, I don't know. I would say I'm kind of stuck on milieu as for what the embryo constitutes for the being. versus field, but I could suppose you could say field would be just as appropriate to me as the lay reader in terms of this is the sort of stuff, whatever that stuff may be, like the potential, although like again this gets a bit confusing too, just to throw this in there as well with respect to how the virtual is not necessarily related to the possible, which gets a
Yes.
bit confusing as well, but they're tied in the sense of like the field or the milieu sort of is the grounding, maybe as a shortcut for the potential differentiations or individuations rather that occur down the line, if that makes sense. Did I give you enough? Are you kind of following
Yeah,
my thought pattern here?
I
Okay.
am. Does he
Just wanted to
say
make sure.
does he say milieu in here?
He does not. I think field is what he sticks
He
to
does mention
terminology.
field. Yes, I do
I
remember
was
that.
throwing in milieu just because I'm thinking at like there is discussion of, I don't even know
Yeah,
if
of the
he doesn't really,
biological the
yeah,
egg, for example,
right, right, yeah.
that's what you brought up. Yeah, and we can imagine him just as much talking about the milieu because he is deriving not all of this, but some of this stuff from Simondon, as can be seen when he
Right.
goes into the question of internal resonance within a system, and then the force movement. He gets a little force movement is a much more obscure term, but he does get the notion of internal resonance from Simondon. And so within the milieu, which would, like the egg, be metastable, right? It would not be in a stable state. It would not be a stable system. Um, we can think of internal resonance as starting to point toward your question of field, because the notion of field would obviously imply a field of forces, which we have to be careful not to translate as force field because that implies like some kind of sci-fi shit, even though we can maybe use it as an image, right? Because there would be in a force field a field of forces, but it's at that point the analogy starts to break down, right? But in any case, a field of forces would imply any kind of would allow for these kind of spatiotemporal dynamisms to occur, because the internal resonance requires in the metastability would require for there to be a kind of tension to be resolved in the system. So for example, if we think of, like you brought up Rie, and Deleuze himself brings up the egg, and it stays with Deleuze throughout his work with Guattari, not just in thinking through the body without organs, but that's like one of the main things, both in anti-oedipus and especially in A Thousand Plateaus, where the egg is the intensive spatium that Deleuze will say throughout this method of dramatization. He will talk about this intensive spatium, and so we can imagine a milieu in a more generic sense than an egg being an intensive spatium where there's a tension, a disparity between different forces in the field that uh, that, insofar as they are in tension, require a resolution. So eggs, as Rie says, the embryo, the egg, knows how to make brains, which is why it's smarter than brains. But it's the tension in the various gradients and the various fields of the egg which no constituted individual can undergo. It's that allows for it to individuate out into its various organs, following what Rouillet calls mnemic themes. But I think here what Deleuze is talking about is very close to Rouillet's mnemic themes, because Deleuze is talking about the dramatization of ideas, right? And it's the dramatization of ideas that he's trying to think when he's thinking about how a metastable field can actualize into structured individuals, right? How individuation can be possible from the level of sub-representative ideas. I think that's Deleuze's problem, because Deleuze doesn't want to start, like Simondon, he doesn't want to start with constituted individuals. He doesn't want to start, if we start in extension, if we start with whether it be representations, extension, or extensity, if we don't get down to the sub-representative realm of the intensive, then we're always going to fuck up difference. We're always going to fuck up differentiation, individuation, these other things, right? We're going to have a kind of molar, to use another term, point of view, and we'll never reach the molecular.
Yeah, because I think what I was thinking about was like, I mean, it almost goes into like, because one of the questioners, one of the audience members here, they really do make, I think, a point that I kind of agree with respect to Leibniz's best of all possible worlds being being very cruel ultimately. And
Yeah.
there almost being this implication, but I don't think it's right, that Deleuze would be someone who would be copacetic with a multiverse theory.
That I don't know. That's a good question. I will say, in logic of sense, he wants to say that for each world there is a logic that is at stake, and and thereby he's leaving open this notion of multiple worlds. Now, whether or not that is,
I mean, Desert Islands kind of
to,
has a interesting resonance
Yeah.
there, I think, in a certain way.
And you know how much he gave credence to Leibniz's compossibility, incompossibility of series. We've talked to a few people about this, Simon Duffy, Daniel Smith, and obviously the one thing that Deleuze wants to get rid of from this schema is how God can guarantee the compossibility and incompossibility of series. Like, he doesn't want to like, for Deleuze, you're cheating when you start with God as organizing the series. You're introducing transcendence to an immanent process. So I would say, at the very least, Deleuze would, I think, be amenable. But what did you have in mind? And by the way, I never sort of went back to the virtual and the possible, but we can
get there. I think this will even work within that realm, because I'll kind of so I was even thinking about this in terms of evolution and like the machinic phylum or phyla, with respect to, like, just to use that example I've used in the past about like Dune, the development of the crysknife for the Fremen, right? Like, they're sort of the if you want to say the milieu or the field of Arrakis lays out certain potentials.
Yeah.
Right. And like there's not something that necessarily, I suppose, determines fully the development of the use of a worm tooth as a knife implement, but there is a certain restricted aspect to it, right? Like, the tool, you know what I mean? We can only develop tools from the environment that we're presented with.
Yeah.
And so in that way, the milieu or the field, like, does limit potential action or potential evolution or innovation or creativity in a sense.
I mean, you're right. Water being one of them. One of the things that Deleuze and Guattari talk about is an annexed milieu, right? So they distinguish within the milieu, or they distinguish various kinds of milieus, like Simondon does. Although, to my mind, I'm not exactly sure if he uses this phrase annexed, or I forget if it's annexed, or they have another adjective. It doesn't matter. I'll use just annexed, the annexed milieu, where they talk about an organism is really suffocating. And they use this, I hate to say this, but they're not using the word literally. I won't say metaphorically, but until an annex milieu, which is an energy source that isn't merely, let's say, food, but something more, something that can allow a little bit of leeway for the organism to have more, let's say, variety, or have more access beyond the basic necessities. I think suffocating is a weird way of putting it. I would say without an annex milieu, the organism is merely surviving but not thriving, right? And so we can imagine that one of the things that first has to be secured in Arrakis and always has to be top in everyone's minds, not just the humans living on Arrakis. Maybe the sandworms are a little bit different, since water is anathema to them, but that's an extreme limit case.
Right. But even them, I mean, that still presents a limit to their potentials, right?
But water,
which I think is
what
the
I was
ultimate.
Going to say.
Right, yeah.
Once water is at least accounted for, and we see how that determines everything, then we can talk about a sort of annex milieu, to the point where spice, for example, becomes an annex milieu for all of the other planets and the interplanetary. Arrakis itself is a kind of annex milieu for the possibilities of space travel. So I only brought that up because it's interesting to think about your notion about what's kind of, to some extent, possible. Now, here, I think that it's interesting to note that the way that Deleuze lays out possible, and Guattari in his later works is going to be thinking through possible. He won't even call it the possible. He thinks through possibles. Guattari has a much, I think, different conceptualization of possibility. But within Deleuze's difference of repetition, what he's afraid of, and he gets this from Bergson, by the way, and this is partly the lineage that maybe Guattari is leaping over. But one of the things that that Bergson gives in his I think it is called The Real and the Possible. I'd have to go back and look. I think it's in maybe it's in Mind Energy. It's some of these lectures and essays that I'll look it up later. But Bergson writes about the real and the possible. And so for him, the possible is a kind of when we think about it in comparison to the real, we get into some of the same paradoxes and false problems that we do when we think that when we make this hard and fast distinction between being and nothingness. For Bergson, it would be as though nothingness was sort of first, and then there's being out of nothingness. And so they would be, to some extent, though, when we think about negation, we would have a thing, then we would have the mental operation of negating the thing. And so we would actually have not less than the thing, but more. And he does something similar with nothingness, and he does something similar with possibility, as though possibility was first, and then reality or its realization came next. And Deleuze sees in this a kind of similar type of, let's say, metaphysical false problem. And so for him, it would if we reduce the virtual to the possible, then we have to have the same type of opposition between the virtual and the real. And he draws upon someone like Proust, which will be a refrain throughout his work, not just in Difference of Repetition or a solo work, but throughout, where real without being actual. And then the other half of that is ideal without being abstract. Because the fourth chapter of Difference of Repetition, I know Patton translates it as ideas, and what is it? Is it ideas and the synthesis of difference? It's in Deleuze's French, it's the ideal synthesis of difference, because the virtual side is not only quote unquote ideal in any sort of abstract way, but literally sort of the side of the virtual that pertains to ideas, right? So when we want to make a distinction for Deleuze, the distinction or the opposition is real and actual. And to a certain extent, this isn't even a opposition that is a binary, because there is a third term of the intensive. And that's why he says the full notion is between differentiation with a T and a C, between the virtual and the actual, is the intensive, is individuation. We need all three of those. So it's not even a virtual actual binary. But in any case, the real and the possible, Deleuze doesn't want the virtual to be less real than the actual. Because if we did that, we would have to then extend something similar to difference. We would have to go so far as to say something like, we would have to extend that. I think it would bleed over into the intensive as well, where we would say, okay, well, we only know intensities through the extensive, through the qualities that we experience, even though the intensive is sort of lurking underneath. And so if we do that, then we would say what's real is all the stuff, all the extensive stuff, not the intensive magnitudes. Those would somehow be less real. And then that would also justify a whole history of philosophy that would say representation, like in the Kantian schema, that's what we have to work with, that's real. The sub-representative is somehow less real. And that for Deleuze seems, just like in all cases of the negative and negation, it seems to have things upside down. Because I think for Deleuze, it's not that necessarily extensive is less real, but it's, well, that's a little bit, it's more that it covers over, like for Deleuze, he will, for at least for negativity, he'll call it epiphenomenal. So there is a sense in which if we were to keep the same structure and invert it, there is a sense in which, yes, the intensive is more real. But that's where Deleuze's egalitarianism, I think we should be careful with here, because the actual is just as real as the virtual. So it's not about saying the actual is somehow less real. We start to get into kind of maybe mystical discourse if we just reverse the structure. So I wouldn't. I think we would have to be cautionary there. But obviously, the emphasis is usually that the virtual is somehow less real, which is why a term like today with virtual reality, Deleuze would he'd probably chuckle about it a little bit, right? I can imagine him either not giving a shit or, be like, oh, I already dealt with this in my fucking dissertation. I don't care.
Yeah, I think what I was really like getting, I mean, I have my obvious affinities with monism. For some reason, I find that very appealing. And the questions of determinism. And it's almost like,
do you mean monism or modadism?
I'm not sure, honestly.
No, I only ask because monism is obviously a broader and can apply to across the history of thought, right? I was just wondering if you were thinking of Leibniz here.
Yeah.
The monad.
And Spinoza, yeah.
Okay.
Both.
Yeah. Okay.
Whatever bastardized interpretation I have in my head of said thinkers.
No, but that so monism in that lineage that Deleuze is working through in the let's say that would oppose to Cartesian dualism, let's say, because Spinoza, there is a sense in which it's fair to call Spinoza's monism a monism, and Leibniz. I think around the Cartesian dualism that maybe had too much influence, those are the two great names around that time period that would oppose his dualism. But go on.
and it really goes back to, like I was saying, it's like what the field or the milieu, like the milieu already contains all the potential, just like the embryo, right? The embryo contains
Mhm.
all the instruction sets for all potential or possible, and forgive
It's fine.
the way I'm using both those terms, but I'm just trying to speak from a lay
Potential
context.
works. Potential is a good term. Yeah.
So these potentials are stored in the field, like that doesn't necessarily fully determine that they must individuate necessarily, right? There has to be some other whatever activity or intensity or some process or yada yada. I mean,
There has to be
that's
some sort of internal resonance, which we can
right.
think of as inductive, right?
Or pressure, force to move whatever organism or technology or whatever, right? It's all kind of all that sort of in the same realm of importance with respect to the main kind of ideas that I'm interested in or fascinated by with respect to the potentials, the infinite potentials, or maybe even not necessarily infinite potentials, but whatever array or set of potentials are laying out at the very beginning, right? Like almost, what is it with respect to the predicate and the subject? With like the subject is already in the predicate, or vice versa. I don't remember
Yeah.
specifically what
According to
that is.
Leibniz's analytic method, an analytic proposition would contain the predicate and the subject.
But it sort of gets at the very same kernel of the idea that I'm wrestling with respect to determinism and potential. I don't know if that's helping at all,
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
because there's almost too like this retroactive, like Freudian thing with respect to like it's almost the weird reversal of like individuation is the past and the the monad is the future. Like the egg is the future and the individuation is the past.
hmm.
Because all possibility, because the individuations that are occurring are all just derivatives of the one potential milieu or field or what have you, right? And again, those are not necessarily restricted. Like none of those are guaranteed to be actualized in the world or the field or
Right.
the milieu, right? Like that there's some, I suppose, free play or whatever chaos at work with respect to what potentials get actualized in the world.
I think I understand what you mean. It's that
And I mean, I'm even tempted to say there's like a weird, like, I mean, this is all shit that I've spewed in the past about like determination in the last instance too. Even kind of almost gets, I think, in my kind of layperson brain, like, kind of makes sense. It's like when the forces actualize or when the forces reach a certain level of intensity at the last instance, then the determination is reached. But so there is this weird determination, but not determined. Like if that determinism, but not determined fully. I don't know.
yeah, I think I
Like
see.
there's not a necessarily opposition between those. It's like again, that goes back to the whatever monadic force there is, or yada yada. But I'm getting really sloppy with my terminology, so I apologize.
No, I think I understand. You're trying to articulate how the differential aspect of the differentiated aspect of, let's say, the egg or the milieu is its structured aspect is, let's say, provisionally past. These are provisional terms. And
Because I mean, I think, okay, let me even say one thing in this too. Let me get here because I think this actually does kind of fit with Deleuze because what Deleuze is saying is representation, like the individual outcome, the representation is not the important. That's like what philosophy and like everything is focused on these on sort of the past in a sense, like in the way that the individuation is the focus, like the representations of difference, their actualization is the focus of our thought in philosophy, historically speaking. But really, we should be focusing on the undifferentiated, the egg. Like that's the real thing we should examine, which the egg is pure difference. I don't know.
Well,
I sound like a madman, but
it, if by the intensive, if that's what you mean by pure difference, then yeah, we could go there. I was just thinking about how the virtual for Bergson, when he locates the virtual, he is thinking about, let's say in matter and memory, for example, he does find virtual domains in the past, let's say through memory, right? So that aspect, if we think on a Bergsonian level, like with the cone, then we could start using terms like past. And I think this is also why Deleuze has those two different schemas of in logic of sense, where one would be according to which the according to the notion of ion, the past and the future indefinitely subdivide the present, which doesn't quite exist, right? Whereas in the notion of chronos, past and future are really just kind of aspects of a present that sort of coexists indefinitely. So there's ways in which Deleuze will try to paradoxically, again, this is why there's obviously for Deleuze against the orthodox image of thought, he proposes a paradoxical one, and there's a way in which he tries to hold those two domains together, which would mean, following what you're trying to say, is that yes, there's a way in which we can think of instead of the egg as sort of constituting a beginning point that would be in the past, and then we have individuation and the individual, which might live in the present, and then the future would be its, let's say, its death drive, its imminent detour towards going back into the dissolution into its elementary aspects. There's a way in which you're right, following Rouillet and perhaps this dynamic point of view. We do have virtual structurations that we can locate, let's say, provisionally in the past. We do have individuations that are going on more or less continuously, even on like down to the cellular level. But then the future is the egg, which never quite exhausts all of its potentials, right? It's a limit that's never reached, which is why Rouillet likes to think about the adult as carrying the embryo with it to a certain extent.
I mean, even interestingly, like Spinoza with we don't know what a body can do also kind of like fits in that same, like, I don't know, idea or something like that. But kudos to you for sussing all of that out. You really did nail exactly what I was, I think, trying to say.
I think I understood. I think this is partly why Deleuze, even in this 67 paper, is, if you look at our notes, when he lays out at the start those some aspects, one of which is the larval or embryonic subject. I do think embryonic subject, again, he may not directly get this from Rouillet, although he mentions Rouillet in this talk. I do think he has in mind the genesis of the living forms, neo-finalism, and chapter 4 of the elements of psychobiology, which is the book, if you remember, that Daniel Smith wants to see translated. I do think that this notion of larval subject, embryonic subject, is interesting, right? Because for Deleuze, we don't begin with a subject who, following the Kantian schema, has faculties of understanding reason and imagination and is sort of applying concepts and to intuitions through sensibility, and therefore being able to, have access or think phenomena, but not the thing in itself. If you recall in this, what I was thinking about actually with the thing in itself was how Deleuze talks about the thing and idea. I don't know if you saw that translation. He actually speaks that way in French. I'm wondering if he's replacing the thing in idea, quote unquote. Um, he's replacing the thing in itself with the thing in idea. Anyway, that's a whole another thing that he doesn't really ever follow up on. But I will say this notion of larval subject is interesting because for Deleuze, in Difference of Repetition, we see that thought only occurs when a problem forces us to think, when there is an encounter, when signs sort of provoke a kind of violence. This goes back to the cruelty that you were mentioning earlier, which not only he associates with Artaud, but with Leibniz. The best of all possible worlds is also the cruelest, but in any case, he's thinking about how thinking there's a genitality of thinking. He also gets this from Artaud, but like thinking has to be given birth to within thought. And so the subject doesn't pre-exist in any sort of sense. It's we saw this in anti-oedipus where it's a residue alongside the machines. It's merely residual. And I think that there's something similar going there to in the interplay between the body without organs and the desiring machines. In that third synthesis, the conjunctive synthesis, there is the possibility of subjects sort of being discerned there, as they say. But I think that that's the thing, is that they are provisional, contingent. They're not sort of pre-given. They're not equivalent with, let's say, the cogito, right? Deleuze himself kind of mentions in this method of dramatization essay where there's like, not only are there twistings and torsions and forces that the embryo undergoes that no adult could, but he seems to be indicating that this is true on the plane of thought, where only a larval subject could undergo the violence that thought demands, and that a fully individuated cogito would not withstand. And
Interesting.
So there is something there, without getting too Laurelian, but there's something there that Deleuze is talking about, the force of thought.
Yeah. I mean, I was
In
even
his
saying,
own way, not necessarily. You'd have to bend and twist some stuff to get them to align, but between Laurel and Deleuze. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that what you were just sort of saying with respect to, I guess, the subjects, are like their potential is there, but it's not until there's the intensive encounter with a problem that they sort of, I don't know, become or what have you. Forgive my shitty way of describing that.
But let's put it this way: it feels like the cogito, let's say, and I'm not picking on Descartes here. The individuated thinking subject, if we want to use that, which is not what Deleuze is trying to think with the larval or embryonic subject, but with with an individuated thinking subject who, let's say, can only think through individuated terms like concepts. There's a sense in which Deleuze is trying to implicate this in the reason for why differences itself never had a concept. It's always been subsumed under identity, even identity in the concept, which is why he wants to go to sub-representative ideas. Concepts would be sort of, I know this will obviously shift and be refined later in what is philosophy, but for now, Deleuze is kind of thinking about concepts really get their grip and their strength from ideas, and there's a distinction between the two. And in any case, I think that the problem for Deleuze, I believe, is that there's a sense in which remaining on the level of the individuated thinking subject, on, let's say, the level of consciousness, to the detriment of all things, all these dramatizations and these determinations, these tensions, these resonances. This is all going on unconsciously. And he doesn't just mean that on the human realm, right? He's definitely thinking the unconscious, whether we call it the molecular unconscious or the machinic unconscious. He's definitely thinking it beyond the realms of any psychical apparatus, like Freud.
Yeah, right.
Will
Yeah, it's like the almost like I mean, again, this goes back to my affinity with monads and
Mhm.
what have you. Is like, yeah, uh the I mean, it gets to almost like a panpsychist, which I know people shit on, but I kind of like feel like I don't know. I'm kind of like sympathetic to panpsychism and like there being an emergent intelligence of the universe in itself, right? The collection of singularities, to get Leibnizian with it, does produce its own sort of consciousness, although it may be right. It's not necessary. It's not embodied by anything, any particular thing.
Yeah, it is. I'm trying to.
Almost like the market too, right? Like the market is an aggregate intellectual capacity without a specific body. It is a transcendental intelligence, right? It's like the collection of monads, the collection of exchanges, the collection of purchases and production and consumption does provide an emergent intelligence, a calculation, right?
Yeah, Deleuze says at the end of chapter 4 of his repetition, and I think this is just what he does. He's going to really, really shift what we even understand by consciousness, which he had already done earlier in chapter 2, where he kind of says all is contemplation, which he says actualization takes place in 3 series: space, time, and also consciousness. Every spatio-temporal dynamism is accompanied by the emergence of an elementary consciousness, which itself traces directions, doubles movements and migrations, and is born on the threshold of the condensed singularities of the body or object whose consciousness it is. It is not enough to say that consciousness is consciousness of something, which is what Sartre critiques, and Husserl always says, no, consciousness is something. It is the double of this something, and everything is consciousness because it possesses a double, even if it is far off and very foreign. Repetition is everywhere, as much in what is actualized as in its actualization. It is in the idea to begin with and runs through the varieties of relations and the distribution of singular points. It goes on and on. But I think that if we extend this out, we can see that Deleuze very much is, again, I can't help but see this as a Ruyerian type of reflection. Now, the one thing I would say, and where I think Deleuze is being maybe a little too fast here, although, again, this is ending a chapter and it's provoking a kind of what the fuck point. Rouillet himself attributes, if you remember, consciousness to all forms. It's just that he will, primary forms, right? So he'll, to molecules, to cells, he will attribute consciousness to them. It's just that he does distinguish between primary forms and secondary aggregates, right? So a pile of stones would not qualify. But, I think that Rouillet, as interesting as that is, and as, again, obviously speculative as it is, I wonder about this claim, right? Everything is consciousness insofar it relates to a double, however far for foreign. That already is kind of a funny thing, because we would have to really follow Deleuze very closely and to what extent that can be borne out. But in any case, we couldn't necessarily equate it with what we might think of as in a psychological sense, because now,
Yeah. Well, even like
that's
okay,
why it can't, can you even call it panpsychist, because now we're not even really talking about the same thing that psychology studies, for example.
sure. What about,
Anyway.
here's something that might help, I think, tie it together would be Simone Doan, right? Simone Doan discusses, and I'm painting with very broad brush here, but basically like feedback. So, which would sort of almost be like feedback is a communication process that occurs,
Mhm.
which would be I think you could make the leap to feedback and problems, right? A problem is a type of feedback, it's a type of communication. And perhaps through a communication, you could sort of imply some type of a consciousness, right? Because what is communicating with you, like, if that makes sense, like what's on the other side of, like what there's forces or something that's behind the rock, the stone in your shoe, right? That prompts you to take off your shoe, right? Like and remove it, right? I don't know. I don't know if that helps, but I think perhaps the aspect of communication between the quote unquote conscious individuated subject and the environment could perhaps imply some type of a, I don't know, a broader definitional notion of consciousness
Yeah.
on the behalf of the environment. Because it
Yeah.
communicates something to us. It gives us data, it gives us information. And then that almost starts the dialectical dialogue of and feedback between environment and subject, etc. Just like global warming, right? Like, okay, we interact with, we're faced with problems of energy, yada yada. We develop processes through a feedback process of experimentation, etc. We reach fossil fuels. We start to propagate carbon in the atmosphere. Then the the reciprocal loop of that becomes the feedback the Earth gives us back, to which we must then respond and think through how to maintain ourselves, how to reproduce ourselves as the environment, the milieu, the field itself shifts, due to our own participation in this process of communication with the inorganic, or not necessarily inorganic, but non-human, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the interesting thing where dramatization is without for Deleuze necessarily being inherently tragic or comic or a combination of the two, although it can veer towards one or the other or both. For him, that doesn't preclude the determination of problems resulting in cruel solutions. Now, this is the interesting thing, right? And all I mean to say by this is that, you know, there is a sense in which for Deleuze, dramatization doesn't necessarily mean that the solutions won't be cruel. But so much depends, I think, for Deleuze on how we determine problems, which relies on all of the, you know, either saying all of the faculties, but I was going to also say like all of the various disciplines of knowledge. It's not obviously for Deleuze merely a mathematical or even merely a scientific exercise or philosophical, right? It's definitely involving all of the resources at hand, but he will say that not just we provisionally, I think it's societies too, whole, and we could extend to the whole of humanity. We have the solutions we deserve on how we determine problems. And obviously, we have very, very poorly determined certain problems like climate change or the continuation of the human species. And so the solutions do seem more and more dire and more cruel as we let this dramatization play out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm even thinking too in terms of the embryo and like even the notion of calculus, right? It's like calculus and physics and all of the advanced sciences and mathematics already exist. Like the embryo already knows that too. The embryo already knows all of the forms of math, right? And people talk about mathematics being the like knowing the mind of God, which is kind of a hubristic thing, right? But nevertheless,
Oh, well, I would at least say just to because
just to
when
rein me in.
no, but well, because when Rouillet says something like the embryo is smarter than the brain because it knows how to create brains, something the brain doesn't know how to do. obviously there's a bit of tongue in cheek there, and
Sure,
you could
but
fine
still,
grain it and say there's a difference between savoir and savoir faire, right? There's a difference between knowing and knowing how. So that's the only thing. Yes, I would agree with you that the embryo knows how to harness all of these things. And then obviously knowing would be a question then of, does that involve representing linguistically, symbolically? If it doesn't necessarily involve representing or depicting or designating, but doing, then yeah, the embryo does know. And that's like the thing that um
that's
is a
pretty. That's fucking interesting.
yeah, all right. So so it all depends on the emphasis we put on the syllable of knowledge, but yeah, I do think that that's part of what Deleuze has in mind with spatiotemporal dynamisms, is why the egg is so instructive, right? The egg knows how to dramatize based on its relative stock of energy. It has a plethora of information that it can draw upon to actualize the differential structures it contains in its genetic code, right? Obviously, different eggs doing different things, and that's why you kind of called yourself back from the ledge by saying it has an infinite potential, which you're right to do so. Um,
I mean, if you're thinking of a cosmic like monadic egg or something like that, that's like that's a what do you call it in uh something reductio ad infinitum, blah blah blah. But I'll cut
reductio
that
ad
out.
absurdum.
I'm just kind of I'm using that extreme example, kind of a hyperbolic example, I suppose. That would be the better way to
Yeah.
say it.
I mean, he does say the world is an egg, and I don't think by world he means the earth. Although
Yeah,
in the
no, I
body without
would.
organs, they will
The
say the
Earth is
earth
an
is a
egg.
body. Yeah. So, but here, I think in the, and I'd have to check the French. I don't know if he says la terre. He might just say le monde is an egg. Isn't one? There's, if the world is an egg, that's why we only have one of them, because one is an œuf. No, that's a bad French joke that you've probably heard used in different contexts. In any case, we could see this obviously extended beyond the earth to the cosmos. I think that's the Stoics, at least. This is the interesting thing for Simondon, right? Spinoza and the Stoics go so far as to attribute the individual to, whether for Spinoza, substance, i.e., nature, God, which I think is very close to the Stoics, and the cosmos. The cosmos would be the individual par excellence. And then obviously with Leibniz, everything is an individual, and it's individuals all the way down in the monads. And this is why Simondon uses Spinoza and Leibniz, the ones we were just talking about with monism. He uses them as sort of counterexamples. They are the boundaries of the extremes to which thinking the individual can be taken. And for him, they are both unsatisfactory reasons, but that gets us a little bit far field of what we're doing here. It's connected a little bit, but it gets us far field. In any case, yeah, I do think that one of the things that's interesting for me is that, and this is just a way of, since we've really been talking around the his discussion and not going through it, only because this is kind of a blueprint of a very small part of difference repetition, and I just we wanted to be able to dramatize some of the ideas in the essay. I will say, as a way of provisionally letting us like have an open-ended close to our conversation, that it is interesting that the language of ideas with a capital I fades into the background, if not drops out, mostly uh, during and after the work with Guattari. So I think that what's interesting would be not only obviously their work together, but their very last work in what is philosophy, which would be like what has the concept when philosophy is defined as the creation of concepts, as that's its function, that's its goal, that's its milieu, its métier. What happens to the idea in what is philosophy? In the book that they co-wrote together at the end, that would be an interesting like connectivity to see how the idea and what qualifies it shifts into analyzing the concepts with its components, with its way of being thought about there. Because I will say a lot of the aspects of what the idea is for Deleuze and difference repetition gets translated and transformed into understanding how concepts work. So that is an interesting thing. And I will obviously give you the floor if you had something else you wanted to bring up.
I thought this was particularly interesting. And this kind of goes a little bit in the direction of what I've been discussing. I'm going to read this whole paragraph, I think. What defines the compossibility of a world is the convergence of those series which are each constructed in the vicinity of a singularity all the way to the vicinity of another singularity. The incompossibility of worlds, on the other hand, arises at that moment when the generated series diverge. The best of all possible worlds, therefore, encompasses a maximum of relations and singularities under the condition of continuity. In other words, a maximum convergence of series. That's super interesting. Now, we see how in such a world, individual essences or monads are formed. Leibniz says that both the world does not exist outside the monads that expresses it and that God created the world rather than the monads. God did not create Adam the sinner, but the world in which Adam sinned. Again, that's fabulous. The singularities of the world serve as principles for the constitution of individualities. Each individual envelops a certain number of singularities and clearly expresses their relations with respect to his own body. Consequently, the express world virtually pre-exists the expressive individualities, but does not exist actually outside the individualities which express it little by little. The process of individuation determines the relations and singularities of the ideal world to be incarnated in the qualities and extensions filling up the intervals between individuals. This approach towards a depth populated by relations and singularities, the resulting formation of individual essences, and the consequent determination of qualities and extensions are the elements that constitute a method of vice diction, which itself constitutes a theory of multiplicities, always subsuming each thing under its case. To me, one of the key passages there, or points there, was like God created the possibility for Adam to sin.
Yes.
Which in itself is a fascinating question with respect to determinism, right? Like, it's like the field is present, like the potential to sin is out there, but it doesn't necessarily get actualized until at the last instant.
I mean, I guess that's one way to say it. I always, it's interesting though that it's God creating the world and not just Adam the sinner. He didn't. So like, there's an overarching architectural design of differential relations rather than just throwing in one element or the other, right? So I think that's part of the understanding of Leibnizian and serialism to a certain extent, right? There's a convergence and divergence of series between which and around which there are singular points, and those constitute worlds. And so shifting a monad here or there, like Adam the sinner, completely fucks up the series, right? Like so I think that's one of the reasons why for Deleuze in his understanding of Leibniz, God has to drop out, because we can't start with worlds. we actually start with pre-individual fields that coalesce into series that diverge or converge. And
Is the
so
world not a series of fields?
yes, but again, for Deleuze, I think that he wants to get rid of a way of understanding not just serialism, but the way of understanding the transcendental field as being in any sort of determining relation between capital W world, capital S self, and capital G God. All three of those are avatars of transcendence that overdetermine sort of what is at stake for Deleuze. So this is why the subject is provisional and residual and contingent, rather than the source and center of the transcendental field, like in Kant. God obviously has plays a whole role in not just the history of philosophy, but in the history of various forms of thinking. And I think that it's interesting to see some of the, like you see this sometimes in process theology, or we talked about a little bit with Mayasu's inexistent God or the future God, where God is not sort of the author or at the beginning, guaranteeing and anchoring everything. They're the possibility of an immanent God. You see this somewhat in Whitehead. I think that you see this in various other forms, other thinkers, somewhat in Rouillet, I think. And then like with world, I think for Deleuze, if you start with world, you've already presupposed the pre-individual field. It's just a part of the package, rather than beginning with pre-individual fields and seeing how worlds form. Right? So it's kind of, I think that that's part of the, whether it be like the eternal return aspect of his work and difference repetition, or whether it be just his commitment to immanence. Like if a world forms, it forms out of the interaction of metastable fields and
Yeah.
milieus.
Because it's an individuation in itself.
If a self forms, it forms out of a concretion of larval subjects.
Right.
If
Yeah.
a God forms, it's imminent to the process, and none of these deserve a capital letter. Like that's kind of how I see it. There are
Yeah.
provisional selves, provisional worlds, provisional gods.
Don't you think it's interesting that like that idea is kind of like in Leibniz in a sense? It's not full, not exactly, but like it kind of, you could totally see the logic that Deleuze derives out of that, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very Leibnizian, but like at that last little quirk, right?
Well, that was kind of
Turning
Deleuze's,
Leibniz on his head, right?
yeah. Well, that was kind of Deleuze's point in the quote the block quote that I read for the cold open. Deleuze is like, look, you can see how Leibniz goes up. There's an oscillation. He goes up to this limit, for example, of thinking the virtual and its reality, but he falls back into possibility. Or the same thing with pulling away from Descartes, only to sort of coincide with a kind of Cartesian interpretation. And I think that that's Leibniz is a very complicated guy, super smart guy, obviously, and you have to think obviously the pressures of the time. God had to be, you couldn't be too far from
Yeah, that makes sense.
having God in your system, from having a theodicy. But also, I think too, Leibniz is worried about.
But even the field that Leibniz exists in, right? Like the right, the thought, the process of thought itself hasn't reached a certain level of individuation with respect to our relationship to God itself at a social or cultural level, at least. Right.
You
So
mean,
like you're still trapped. He's kind of like it could be either he sees the strings or he can't, he's a fish in the water, right? Like he can't really get out of the water to look back and see the impact that this idea of God, the concept of God itself, is a restraining image of thought that keeps him from taking the next leap, right? That's why it has to occur later.
Right.
Perhaps, I don't know.
How much can we read into the,
because that kind of goes back to my ultimate point with respect to like the innovations and the creativity and the pre-individual milieu or the field of what's possible too, right? Because Leibniz had different constraints than we're dealing with now with respect to thought, because we have a much wider, right, like things to progress to a much larger what have you, like the status quo of thought itself.
Yeah. The orthodoxy. How much is lip service to the powers that be, so that one doesn't get excommunicated or persecuted or thrown in jail? How much of that is true inspired belief? But even that, how much of that is again a product of the milieu in which one is channeled down various means of
because it's like for Leibniz it'd be something akin to it's more difficult to posit the death of God than it is for yada yada to bastardize the Mark Fisher quote about capitalism, right? Like,
right. I got you. I mean, like, and this could be part of our closing thoughts. When you brought up the whole thing about the world in which Adam sins, it's the world. The compossibility is of, let's say, this, and Deleuze will go on to define compossibility and incompossibility in terms of events. This is part of the logic of sense, right? Why different worlds would have different logics. There would be a totally different world in a world wherein Adam didn't sin, to a certain degree, right? If we follow this. Now, of course, for Deleuze, I think this is a Leibnizian example, and so God is still in the background. But we can imagine that a world without the infinite debt of Christianity and in the Nietzschean sense of genealogy of morals might be a world in which Oedipus isn't a figurehead of the Oedipal complex, at least, right? So you can imagine a world without Oedipalization in a world in which we live might be incompossible, but only provisionally, right? Because I think that what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do is to say that there is a way that Oedipus can be jettisoned. The world we live in currently is still producing Oedipus, but that's not a universal. That's still a contingent.
Oedipus is out there in the field or the milieu, but that doesn't mean that it has to be expressed in this particular way, or even at all.
Things can be determined differently, right? The ideas can be determined differently.
Exactly. Yes.
The drama isn't played out in advance.
It's all and again, I'm going to go to determination in last instance.
Yeah.
Punch me in the groin.
Well, I mean, but I think that's the thing. Like this is why they have to historicize Oedipus and show that it hasn't always affected. It's not a universal.
Right. Yeah.
If it were universal, schizoanalysis would be a intellectual masturbation. It may be for others who want to see it amounting only to that, but it's not intellectual masturbation on this, I feel, convincing argument that Oedipus is not a transcendental. Yeah, exactly. It's not a transhistorical, or it's not a part of our. It's not a part of the human condition, and even if it were, humans can change, right? Like,
precisely.
So, I don't know. I think that
based on the problems that we encounter, but do the problems determine? Like that's the kind of tricky, cruel aspect of it, is what kind of problems determine this world, that results in this cruelty. That makes sense. Like there is a determining factor in terms of the problems that we encounter by chance and by contingency that lead to this sort of thing. That's maybe the part where I would like, I don't know. That's where like Frank Herbert and Deleuze, I don't know if I'm like ready to go all the way in that sense, but I'm fascinated nevertheless, obviously.
Yeah, the only hope we can have is that if solutions are determined by problems, it's not quite. That's not the only. That's only
Sure.
part of the equation, because it's the problems that have to be determined for those solutions to result from them, right? So this is why I brought up climate change earlier.
Really, like you said, really I think the rejoinder to that would be like it's about how and what problems are determined and prioritized as well, which is contingent and so on forth.
And I know that we didn't even talk about it, but that's one of the reasons why Deleuze rejects what is as a proper way to formulate questions and therefore even get to the heart of problems. It's all these other examples that he gives in the history of philosophy that actually show how problems are determined in a more interesting and more precise way. When, how, to what extent, who, all these other examples he gives keep us from badly determining problems. So like the to ask the question, what is climate change, can only get to a kind of masturbatory back and forth that could just involve some
it's a natural process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just that's weather, blah blah blah. Yeah.
Yeah. That kind of, that's not quite the questions that scientists ask, though, as we know. They don't ask what it is, not in any sense that is an open-ended question. They seek determinations on various different levels. One of which is, to what extent can we continue in this without completely fucking everything up, which we've probably already crossed. So anyway, yeah, happy New Year.
2025. Getting started right.
Yes, sir.
Woo. All right. Well, I really enjoyed that. I didn't know we'd have this rich of a conversation about my kind of speculative nonsense. So I appreciate you being able to adroitly roll with those punches that I threw.
Yeah, man.
Well done. It's like a nice little improvisational wrestling match where like kind of you're like kind of going with the flow there.
You're working yourself into a shoot, brother.
I suppose that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machine of Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.